Hello and welcome to the Tonearm, where we connect you with the people and ideas moving culture forward. I'm your host, Lawrence Purrier. Bryan Senti won a BAFTA for scoring the BBC series Mood. He's composed for films since 2015 and worked with artists like Regina Spektor and Mark Ronson. But his new album, La Marea, tells a different story, his father's story. La Marea takes Cuban migration and turns it into sound. His previous album, Manu, honored his Colombian mother through short violin pieces. This time, Bryan spent a year rebuilding his chops on the instrument he quit at 18, then recorded with the Czech National Symphony Orchestra. The result mixes classical precision with Latin American folk traditions and ambient textures. He recorded it specifically for Dolby Atmos, 800 tracks of strings, all acoustic, creating what he calls the feeling of being adrift at sea. We're putting the Tonearm's needle on Bryan to talk about rediscovering the violin as an adult, why techno influenced a string orchestra album, and what it means to honor family stories through music. Here's Bryan Senti. I want to ask a little bit about the importance and the impetus for you of telling your family stories now across a couple of different projects. What's that about?
Yeah, well, thanks for recognizing that. I mean, I feel like these two records are a diptych, and then after that, I'm kind of set free. Yeah, the impetus started because when COVID happened and the pandemic kind of shut things down, I felt like it became like my time to make a record. And it occurred to me that even though I was a string player my whole life and had done a bunch of projects for other people, I didn't really know what my perspective on the instrument was going to be. And furthermore, I kind of struggled with a bunch of things about the instrument and about classical music in general, I think, from grad school and from growing up. And my feeling was that one of the issues that I had coming from a pretty blue collar Hispanic family. My father was a minister and my mom was a dental hygienist, both of whom left their countries under duress. My father from the Cuban Revolution, and my mother was an orphan in Colombia. Her father was like killed at the beginning of La Violencia, which was their revolution, kind of their civil war. Anyway, they were kind of people who, while they really enjoyed classical music, for them it was like a very elite thing and kind of a fancy thing that they thought their child could go into. And I think that's kind of true. But we were always surrounded by kind of more humble people. And our families were humble. And again, my father was a minister in the Latin church and the Hispanic church, and dishwashers, people who had just come over. And so anyway, I say that because, for me, I felt very privileged from my parents to have gotten a good education and go to Manhattan School of Music and study violin and then Carnegie Mellon and then Yale. And that felt great. And I think at a certain moment in time, maybe I even kind of pretended to myself like, I could be a part of this aristocratic American class or something like that. But it occurred to me, obviously over the years that was like a form of perhaps self-hate. And also,
Sure.
yeah, it just didn't honor my family story. And so I guess that became a problem for me. Yeah, that became a problem for me with classical music in general. And maybe that's why I didn't pursue it in kind of the more traditional sense, is that I just couldn't completely identify myself with it, as beautiful as it is. And I feel like I'm almost kind of disparaging some of the composers, but that's not the case, for a lot of people. I think people can kind of feel more comfortable in that space. But just with my family story, I didn't. So I felt like with Manu, I had to figure out a way to tackle this issue. And so my way to tackle it was to look into Latin American music, look into Latin American folk music,
Wow.
figure out what I could bring to the performance practice of the violin that both honored my training as a classical, person, but also honored this story and connected the dots. I feel like there was like a lot of soul searching in that, particularly with Manu. So I think with Manu, I started delving into my mother's story, particularly like the kind of vibe and ambience afforded through the vistage of the Andean mountains in Colombia. Yeah, something more salt of the earth. I think when I finally came to La Marea, I kind of wanted to expand out and take some of that style that I had created in Manu and blow it out into something that could create larger compositional forms, get more experimental, I think, in the composition itself, not just focused on the playing. It's kind of, I can keep talking about this, but one of the things that I did in Manu is kind of like, in a funny way, kind of focus on articulations. Like each piece they were much shorter, and they were in a way kind of etudes, if you will, or short songs, if you will. And I was able to focus on like little different styles, like pieces would focus on pizzicato, for example, or, like playing like a guitar or different kind of arco articulations. And that felt really good in Manu. And then for this, I went into a much more experimental place.
You had a violin placed in your hands at a pretty young age, if I'm correct, right? Like,
Yeah. Yeah, I was 3. So it's a form of child torture
I'm sure it's a little bit of adult torture too.
and parental torture. Yeah. And I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm gifted at it, or was gifted at it. I mean, but it's a brutal, and violin's just like a brutal instrument, and it's almost sport to stay kind of physically capable of doing all that it affords, particularly if you're going to try and be a classical soloist. But yeah, no, I started at 3, started playing more and more serious pieces. By the time I kind of soft quit when I was 18, I was playing the Sibelius violin concerto and like working through that.
Wow.
And then I had kind of like a panic attack regarding the whole thing, because I just knew I wasn't the person who could I didn't have the temperament. You need to have a certain temperament to be a soloist. And then again, as an orchestral player, as beautiful as I find the orchestra, I didn't see myself kind of going through that kind of an audition process and playing kind of similar rep for the rest of my life either. So I took I kind of took a break from it, but I also, my teachers at the time were like, well, maybe you should do some composition. And that's what got me into composition, was taking a break from the violin at 18.
What was the evolution of your relationship with the instrument? Like, you had this sort of experience at 18 of you said soft quit. Was the intention always to come back? Like, did you know it was a soft quit at the time? How did you frame it?
No, I thought I was quitting. Yeah, for me, it was quitting. Yeah, I mean, again, yeah, it's like, there was, I think probably, you start at 3, when you're in your younger adolescence. And if you're good at the instrument, or good at any instrument, or good at any sport or anything, probably you feel a sense of pride about it. And it's like what makes you special. And I think that's a beautiful thing. And then by the time you start to get older and you start to get, into this more semi-professional zone, then the stress of the reality of the whole thing starts to come together.
Yeah.
I mean, I really feel it's almost like playing a sport. So for me, it was like hanging up my cleats at 18 and being like, thank God this is over. I don't have to like run to the bathroom before a concert or something like this. Yeah. And I'm 42 years old. So I missed this magic moment. I think right after I quit like beta blockers and performance theory and like focus, flow state theory and all this kind of stuff started to come into play, that kind of really helped performers get out of stage fright and get out of that kind of a situation. But before that, in the 80s and 90s,
Yeah.
it was just like
White knuckle.
just white knuckle it. Do you got it? Or do you, it was like whiplash. Yeah. So for me, it was like, oh, I just can't do that. Like, that's just crazy. So yeah, you hang up your cleats and it's like a sad affair. And then but I did composition and I started to feel, just for me, it was like learning something new. And even though I was in college for it, I had a really good understanding of theory and ear training and all this stuff from the violin and repertoire. So for me, composition was easy just to get the hang of that early on. And so I felt really good about that. Then eventually went to grad school for that. And then my fear was, while I was in grad school, that I was like, oh crap, maybe I'm not going to make enough money doing this. And a teacher at the time kind of messed me up at Yale, unfortunately. He'll go nameless, but I think he probably meant it as having faith in me. But he was like, you're not going to be a teacher. He's like, you're not going to be a professor. Now, ironically, I want to be a professor and I think I would be a really good professor. But I think at the time he was probably right. He's like, you got to go out and write music. I think instead of like following that completely, I assisted Rufus Wainwright for like several years and then fell into advertising and then worked my way into film. And then, and this was all in New York, I got 2 films into Sundance, met Dustin O'Halloran, who's been a dear friend of mine since then, all these years. And he invited me to help him on this TV show called Transparent.
Yeah.
And he's like, "What instruments do you play?" And I was like, "Well, I guess I play violin. I still have the violin,
I guess I play violin.
And so I start to play, yeah, and I start to play for him on these sessions, and he's like, "Dude, what are you fucking talking about?" He's like, "You play violin." I mean, but by then it was like a lot of half-assed random just playing, sometimes on people's records or on whatever, but not taken seriously. And then after that, I was like, "Oh shit, maybe I did leave something on the table with this." And then the pandemic, years after that, the pandemic happened and it was a time to focus. So when the pandemic happened and I was like, I'm going to do this record that's going to focus on strings, I ended up going on like Thumbtack and calling a violin teacher who I, as luck would have it, was a student of my former teacher back in New York who was living,
Oh, wow.
who was teaching at the Colburn School. And I had kind of this like rocky moment where I was like, I need you to get me back in shape, man. Like this has been too long. Like I obviously like know my way around this instrument, but I need to like get all the technique back and all this stuff back. And in this like very funny moment, like in my later 30s, this guy's like kind of yelling at me the way my like Russian violin teacher was yelling at me when I was like 10 years old, getting me back in shape. And I just like, honestly, like during the pandemic, I also had a newborn, but I practiced like 4 hours a day. Like it was like back in school.
Wow. How long did it take to get back on your feet?
Honestly, probably a year.
Wow.
Yeah, probably a year.
Wow. And what's the milestone there? Like, is it just a feeling or like objective?
I
Like,
feel like it's like being able to play Bach, it's like like a Bach sonata, or the Bach solo pieces.
you had the experience to know what a challenging piece
Yeah.
would be.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to say here that I can
Yeah.
play a Sibelius violin concerto, but can I play down Bach? Yeah, now I can play down Bach, but it took a whole fucking year to be able to play that down. I mean, that's like really thinking about, yeah, I mean, like back to the basics, like what is fourth finger vibrato look like? What's the mechanics of like, just, get out of playing in like such a sloppy way where you like completely understand what your wrist is doing,
Yeah.
how you're pronating your right hand, the difference between a Russian and French bow hold. Like now, the irony of it though was that when I was younger, a violin is such a technical instrument that all this stuff is just like, it's like lore. Your teacher, people would travel all over the world, for example. Like they do, yeah, if you knew somebody in Amsterdam, a great professor who could teach you how to do upbow staccato, an upbow ricochet staccato, and you felt that was the best person in the world to teach you, people would fly all over the world to meet with that professor and meet with that pedagogue. And you have barely an understanding of like, I mean, you're going through puberty. Like, what do you even know about like Russian, French bow holding, or like understanding the mechanics of it's so intense at that moment in your life. Later on, you can actually receive all that information as an adult. And, maybe you're not as fast as you were when you were a kid, but like the advantage of like years of experience in music and just like your own emotional development as a human being actually is really positive. And then the other thing, I want to say, is it Tunebase, or there's these other sites, websites that like now anything like Hilary Hahn will be on YouTube telling you
Yeah.
how to play a certain passage. Like all this stuff has been kind of demystified with the internet. That, yeah, was not the case in 1993.
Yeah.
It's like, it's somehow it's like a much more inviting time. It's a much easier time to learn. I think the obverse of that as a child, like if you're 13 years old, is you go on Instagram, you see a 13-year-old prodigy play, 15 13-year-old prodigies play a piece that you'll never be able to play in your life. And that's, that's obviously terrible, and we can blame Facebook.
Demoralizing.
Yeah, demoralizing. We can blame Meta, Facebook for that. But on the other hand, yeah, you want to learn how to play Brook. You want to learn how to play Paganini Caprice. You could have every measure of it like dictated and have somebody Skype in to work on a particular passage. So that part of it's really cool. And I've used those sites actually just to figure out different techniques.
Yeah.
It's been, yeah, so that's been really cool.
You talked earlier about when you were talking about Manu and you were talking about some of the folk inspired elements from the Latin American experience.
Yeah.
I have a couple questions about that because it's kind of a knowledge gap for me. Is the violin an instrument in those traditions, or did you have to find a way in? And if so, or regardless, what kind of technique adaptation do you have to bring to the table there?
There are string instruments that are kind of like the violin. All that stuff was kind of imported through,
Yeah.
the colonial move from Spain and Europe in general. So yeah, the violin's in there. I think in terms of like adaptations, it's also kind of adapting to play like something that sounds like a pan flute, or the different the different kind of instruments that you would find in Latin American culture. Yeah, and just kind of, I think in general, getting into this more folk place, which what's beautiful about some of the folk music of Latin America, I'm thinking specifically of like Ecuador and the Pasadillos, it's you already have this kind of allusion towards like minimalism. And probably a lot of that is probably coming from like Western African influence also. You have this like beautiful kind of oddly spiritual minimalism that's coming from this kind of music. So just getting into these techniques though they're humble, but they're also lend themselves to a kind of magical realism that music kind of suggests. But yeah, there's so many composers and artists. I think of like people like Atahualpa Yupanqui. But yeah, there's a lot of composers that I was referencing.
It's interesting to me because it strikes me that it feels like there's a resonance between your evolution, not only of like your relationship to your music and to your instrument, but the technique seems to rely less on just being about virtuosity.
Yeah.
Something about this like deeper resonance, or even plugging into to a different tradition for a while forces you into a different sort of psychological construct almost. I don't want to be too heavy-handed, in my word choice here, but it seems very interesting to me that it seems to serve where you're at and to serve your experience well.
Yeah, I mean, in what respect are you saying?
I t-
In the sense that like for me as a person, it's making, it like served me to make me grow as a human, or
Yeah, it seems more. Let me try to articulate this better. It feel from listening to you speak, like it doesn't surprise me that this is the path that the path you went down in terms of exploring a more earthy, less academically hung up
yeah.
form for a little
Yeah, I
while.
mean, I don't know. My wife right now is reading The Artist Way,
Oh yeah.
which I think is such a. I haven't read it, or maybe I read part of it at different times, but she keeps showing me these passages that, like, yeah, and in order to like create a perspective, you have to kind of like build this narrative
Yeah.
from inside, and I feel like that was my problem. I mean, That was my problem, but I feel like that's a lot of people's problems, like in their own life. I mean, regardless of whether or not you're a musician or an artist, I feel like it's, why do you choose to be a lawyer? Why do you choose to be a doctor? You have to make sure that like you've done the requisite introspection to make sure that you can own these choices. Otherwise, should you meet any roadblocks, which you're likely to in life, yeah, it just leads to depression because you feel like you don't have agency over things. And I think I relinquished a lot of agency.
Yeah.
And by the way, I think this is kind of a Northeast thing. So you're from the Northeast. We're in pursuit of trying to make a life for ourselves, and we're in pursuit. We have these goals of like maybe having a family and a nice house and arriving at some level of status, and all these things are like very heralded things in the Northeast. Our Northeast ambition, and
They're like unchallenged assumptions around ambition.
oh man, there's another book, but I can't. It's this book, Constellations, has like a great poem. I wish I had all this stuff dialed up. The book is called Constellations. It has a great poem on ambition and just how ambition's like this wonderful fuel that you use in your youth to get you started. And like it's like a rocket where like eventually the fuel evaporates,
Yeah.
and then what? And then what do you do with this? Then it can become a curse because ambition doesn't serve you at a certain point. You have to move on to serve other things. You gotta serve your family. You gotta serve your partner. So I say that only because for me, things had been kind of just random choices, seemingly random choices about career and music. And, particularly when you work in advertising and film, you get a lot of directives to compose in different styles. And I'm not saying any of that's bad. Obviously, you need to make a living. But at some point, if you do want to connect with music and writing music for its original purpose, which is self-expression, you're going to need to work on what that narrative is. And I have to say, and maybe this is the point that you're suggesting,
Yeah.
it's helped me in other aspects of my life. It's helped me become a more centered person, to know myself a lot better so that I could interface with my wife and my children. I just started having children at the time, Manu, at the time I was starting to write Manu. And boy, does it feel good to feel that in 10 years' time, when I can actually talk about music with my own children, I could be like, you know what? This is something that I actually felt. This isn't just the 60-second commercial that I wrote for Nike, a score where they told me to mix hip hop with classical. This is something that in some ways traces a family story, and perhaps will be insightful for you, at least so that you can understand your father better.
The Tonearm will be right back after this break.
From all of us at the Tonearm, we wish you, your family, and friends a joyful new year. We're thankful to have you as a listener to our podcast and as a reader of our online journal of unexpected music and culture. We have a lot of surprises in store for 2026, so please keep up to date by visiting thetonearm.com. And while you're there, be sure to subscribe to our email newsletter, Talk of the Tonearm. Thank you again, and Happy New Year.
And now, back to the Tonearm. When you were speaking a moment ago, I was thinking about these biographies and stories we have to tell. And I was thinking about every time I go to like a gallery or an exhibition or something or a show, and I read the artist's statement, 9 times out of 10, I think, really? Like, that's how you want me to think of you? Like,
I know.
some of them I can't even get through. And it's like, it makes me feel dumb and uneducated and unaware. And I'm like, man, this is like such a barrier. Like, I don't know if I would want to meet this person in real life.
I mean, that can happen.
Certainly don't want to talk to them.
I hope that kind of, I hope that's intentional on their part if they're trying to
Right.
be that off-putting.
And believe me, it's probably more me than them. Living in Italy while you're working on, or at least now living with this music about Latin American displacement.
Yeah.
Does geography come into play at all? Like, do you get a different perspective, or is that a string I shouldn't be grasping at?
No, I mean, what's funny about this record is I finished it right before leaving. And now the record, it just took a long time to mix, very long, and kind of export and handle. But the record takes on a new significance for me while being here.
Interesting.
Yeah, so we came here because we were kind of running out of money after the writer's strike in LA. In tandem, the city also got very expensive, and we had 2 kids. So not all of it's the city's fault. my wife had just gotten citizenship or a couple of years prior during Trump's first term. We were just like, oh, well, let's see if we can get other citizenships, just it'll be interesting. More as a gag, to be honest with you. But then when we were kind of having some economic difficulties, I was like, you know what? Let's see what's going on with entertainment and let's settle our finances and let's have a sabbatical year in Italy. And which sounds amazing for a lot of people. But it ended, we ended up, the economic situation was sufficiently rough. And then when we got here, obviously, you can't read a book by its cover. Italy has been amazing in many, many respects. But, we're also learning that it's very difficult to work in Europe. And my wife is learning that too. And it kind of, no place is perfect. And right now the world is very chaotic. But it made me think about how, yeah, I never asked my dad before he passed. I'd be curious, I wasn't mature enough to even ask these kinds of questions to think in these ways, but like, I wonder if he thought he would ever return. And I wonder, and it's obvious to me now that like people make moves for their family and because of events, and you're swept up in these events and you don't really know the implications of it as they're happening. And I'm pretty sure we're going to return to the States. But it's also not something that's a given either, right? Life happens where like you can get stuck someplace or maybe things take off in a different place. And so I'm in Italy, I'm at the comune, I'm at, the municipio, I'm learning Italian. And I'm like, I'm away, also applying for Italian citizenship. Wow, I'm an immigrant, I'm kind of an immigrant at this moment. Granted, in a weird kind of like first world way. But it just made me think of my father's story and not have it be so abstract. And I think when I was starting to write, I don't think the record is like abstract in that way, but it was abstracted in the sense that my view of my father's story was an observer's view in the way somebody reads a book or somebody watches a movie. And it's a very funny feeling to feel like it's like the end of The Shining, when Jack Nicholson sees himself, or when they see Jack Nicholson in the photo, it's like all of a sudden, like now I'm in the movie.
Yeah.
And I'm experiencing my own La Marea. So yeah, that's maybe it didn't inform the writing, but it's informed my reception of the writing of the record being here. And in a way has made it kind of like oddly much more emotional, which it was already very emotional when I was writing it at the time.
You mentioned the sort of difficulty with the mixing process and getting the record just like through post-production.
Yeah.
I'm curious. I wanted to ask you a little bit about
Mhm.
the recording in Dolby Atmos.
Which, by the way, is just it's a mistake. It should have been out last week or whatever. It's coming out like tomorrow
Oh, wow.
or something like this. So like, maybe so it's good. This podcast can let people know.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's great. I've talked to a lot of artists in the creative music realm over the last year or so who are increasingly embracing the format, which is fascinating to me.
Yeah.
Because I think our first wave of releases in those immersive formats were basically just shoehorning old classic rock albums into Dolby Atmos, and there were no native productions that took advantage of the format.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious about, is the Atmos form you're composing for? Like, how aware are you of what's the relationship with that format as you're entering the project process?
In this particular record, it was front and center. And I think, I had a conversation with Francesco Dondello, who mixed the record, and he was invited to, I don't know, maybe this is like a top secret military institute. I don't know, but it was it was definitely like a specialized institute in Germany where people are developing special algorithms so that people using binaural like headphones can experience Atmos.
Yeah.
The reason why I say military is like all this kind of stuff usually comes from like the military. It's like tricking people into thinking that sound is coming from different places, up and down. Obviously, we use it in the entertainment realm, but like all the stuff has like military applications. But the reason why I feel like it's valid and has always been valid, I mean, like music in the Renaissance period, yeah, people compose for like elaborate locations, obviously crazy, cathedrals and churches where people could have kind of in a circus maximus, have musicians surrounding And so this, to me, is kind of an extension of that. But I feel like, to be honest, when Atmos first came out, I'm probably like most audio people who are like, gimmick. I'm like, it's a gimmick,
Interesting.
But the funny thing about it is, particularly when you're in a proper Atmos room, you realize that, like, of course, the human ear can understand, and the human brain can understand all these different elements.
Yeah.
We do it all the time. That's how we're able to not to walk and not get vertigo and drive a car and all these kinds of things. And because of that, it is an opportunity to just expand the fidelity to which we hear things. And as people kind of embrace the medium, we're going to be able to create more and more work that utilizes the medium to its full effect. To your point, a lot of records that are using Atmos to simply fold down a stereo mix or unfold, as the case may be, into an Atmos mix, and that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, like, for real, like using a motif that is escaping from, like, a center left upper channel. You hear it as a leitmotif, and you can kind of understand things in different ways, kind of understand composition in different ways through that. That said, in terms of my composing for Atmos, I would say that I'm certainly in my nascency. So there was a lot of this was like done in collaboration, and some of which was at the direction too of Francesco Donatello. And so I'm grateful for that. But in terms of it being created for this purpose, one of the things that's like bananas about this record, which was done also in Manu, but this record is humongous in comparison to Manu. Every single string is recorded with multiple microphones, every part with multiple microphones, and there's a lot of parts. I don't even, to be honest with you, there could be like 700 or 800 tracks, like in La Marea is like Guardians of the Galaxy size in terms of tracks, and it's just strings. And this is like another thing to mention, because some reviews come in. I mean, I've said in the press release that it's influenced by electronic ambient music, but there are no electronics in this record. There are no electronics. All of this is strings, and there's some gentle. I mean, gentle. There's some post processing to the string, like for example, like a string will go through like a delay or a specific reverb or EQ, and then in Tersura specifically, I used like an oscillator that was like specifically to different hertz, so that the parts could weave together in a way that creates this kind of binaural effect. Certainly in the headphones, but in Atmos is like completely bananas.
Good Lord.
It's like an oscillating color field painting, just like all these kind of these waves coming in of like multiple passes of string orchestra
Wow.
running through oscillators. And incidentally, I mean, the funny thing about that too is that actually could be performed live even without an oscillator, but just through some sort of almost like Brian Fernihoe level insanity, like writing every single oscillation dynamic wise of an orchestra, if you wanted to get to that level of granular insanity. So instead of putting the orchestra through that, I actually just put the orchestra through an oscillator. But anyway, the point is that it's all strings.
Is there a live presentation of this music?
The live presentation of this music, as right now, is going to be me playing to tracks and manipulating stuff live. But to be honest, I think you'd probably know this. It's coming from a classical background and coming from a performer background. My vision and dream would be to have this stuff performed live. I mean, it can be performed live. It's a lot of scordatura. It'd be a logistical nightmare. I'm sure normal classical orchestras would scream and complain, but is it possible? Yeah.
Money's the object.
Exactly. I mean, this is the reason why.
Always.
This is the reason why, man, I'm doing records this way. It's like, there's no way. Like, if I can't wait for a commission. If I got a commission and wrote this, they would be like, "You're nuts." No, absolutely not. Like, this is not commissionable.
Yeah.
Can't arrive at this kind of music at commission. And yeah. So I just have to do it, and then maybe in the future, if people like my music, they'll spend the crazy amount of money it requires to perform this live.
Tell me about your interest in techno.
Dude, techno. I got into. I'd say this. I owe a lot of my excitement in techno to my co-producer Justin Moshkovich. as with regards to this particular record, did a very great thing. And he invited me to go to the Movement Festival in Detroit. And I saw a set of R. Rose live, and was just floored. Like, techno. A good friend of mine, Paul Corley, who's also a great musician, people should listen to his music, told me that, like, what's great about techno is it's all about perspective, right? It's music reduced to kind of fundamental elements, like, a kick drum, a snare, or a kick drum hat, and like these gestures that you can just, but like every single one of those gestures that you manipulate, even subtle gestures, kind of allude to sexuality, allude to a different place, allude to different culture, allude to all these different kinds of styles. But it's not necessarily difficult it's not like complicated to understand in its construction. It's like 4 on the floor or more complicated rhythm, and you kind of repeat and create these gestures. Anyway, point is that R. Rose's set was just so unbelievable to me, just so elaborate rhythmically, that I fell down like a wormhole with this person, just kind of reading up on how they created, just how they worked, and learned that they went to Mills College, and, knew like people like Pauline Oliveros and like Robert Ashley and all these the kind of far left wing of classical music, it's so far in the left wing that the core classical community doesn't even really know who these people are. That's like an experimental class that you get at the end of your degree that may mention these people.
Yeah.
But I knew those people, and I was like, oh, this is amazing. And what I loved about their set was that this is avant-garde techno, but the feelings there are not dissimilar to other techno, but in the sense that, like, it allows you to feel lost. The rhythmic complexity would allow you to feel lost, and then there would be these moments where things kind of emerge, and all of a sudden the rhythm would come together and things would lock. And those were those kinds of like exhale moments that you would have as a listener, and where you'd be like, wow, you'd get this rush, like you were on ketamine, even if you weren't on ketamine, you'd get this rush. So it just felt like amazing. And that kind of music, I went home right after after Movement and worked on La Marea, the title track of this. And I was like, that they probably got that inspiration too from classical music, but seeing it in techno felt really important, because techno, again, drawing a connection to folk music, techno is like of the people. Techno is not about showing up in a fucking tuxedo to Lincoln Center. It's about an ecclesiastical, religious experience you can have at 3 a.m. in the dark.
Yeah.
So for me, it felt like a connection point, and helped me, quite frankly, construct that piece, which for me is the centerpiece of the album.
And you say that it impacted your sort of your conceptualization of like tempo, meter. Is that how it manifests?
Yeah, exactly. There's an article that he did for Resident Advisor. It's like Art of Production, where he talks about emerging properties and these like kind of more experimental pieces where like, kind of in oh, what's the word? Oh, I forget what the term is, but like these kind of, oh yeah, like process oriented kind of music, where
Like generative?
like generative process, which was very actually obviously popular from Philip Glass and Steve Reich and all this kind of stuff. It could create like these kind of like audio shapes and audio illusions, like phase music, like Steve Reich.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But he's, they came at it from like an even more kind of weird avant-garde place where like, for example, like I think there was one piece, I'm not sure if he wrote it or if a teacher of his wrote it, where like they're just, rolling on a huge gong for like half an hour, that kind of a thing. And then all of a sudden, like halfway in, you start to hear the other tones and the other harmonics kind of develop. But in fairness, like in that set that he did, it was all, for me, what came together was the rhythmic aspect of it. And also the feeling of feeling lost. And that's kind of amazing too, because particularly today in a world of playlist music, like making things difficult for people or the feeling of loss, which could assume that like the composer doesn't know what they're doing. Like people don't want to be in that space. People want it to feel like I am a genius, like if it's classical music, it's like I am a really amazing composer. Everything is like
Right.
as it should be. Or it's, or we have like, yeah, sleepy time playlists, piano music. But so for me, it was an interesting kind of challenge to have stuff in different meters that are out of time and be in that kind of like an avant-garde world, but also kind of like let it drift. Like let it drift. Let it emotionally feel like, where are we? Only for it to like come back. And then do that a couple times until you get this, amazing release at the end. And then another thing that I got, even with the end, that they did in their set was that it wasn't the bass drop is obviously a fundamental famous part of techno, but they didn't have the bass drop in that traditional way. Like whatever would be technically the bass drop, you would know that moment had arrived, but then somehow like either the bass would crescendo in, so it felt like it was blooming out, or it felt like it was always evolving. And that was also an interesting idea that I took from our Rose, which is that, when the big orchestra comes in at the end of La Marea, it's not like the orchestra comes in like it's Wagner, it's not like Tristan and Isolde, like,
Right.
which is a wonderful gesture, obviously, but it's been done. It's like, no, the orchestra comes in kind of subtly. You're like, and then as you start to breathe through these different sections, you're like, that's orchestra. And it's very loud, it's like, then it becomes really huge and takes over the whole space.
Like this different approach to catharsis or resolution.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And to me, that felt really important.
That's really neat. So you started the conversation. This is really artful. I'm going to go back. I'm going to end with something that you started with. That's
Good.
Yeah, I'm good. If I was a comedian, this would be my callback. You said early on that, you're kind of done with you did the family work.
Yeah.
So now what?
Yeah. I mean, so now, well, I have to say, I feel very inspired. I feel like it's a time for artists to like really convey the importance of, of humanity and human expression. I feel like the world is obviously in a crazy place. So even the smallest gesture is valid. I mean, it's incredibly valid. I mean, for somebody to even make music about, what's going on stateside in one small area of all the political things that are happening would be a huge gesture, because there is this push right now to make everything to seem like it's all right and it's okay and just forget about it and don't look on your phone. There's this push to kind of disassociate. And I understand that obviously, because we all have to like have, to be aware of our mental health, but but that self-expression is so important so that we know that we're all in this together. So yeah, I don't know. I feel very excited about, yeah, talking about current situations. Also, I think it's a moment to, and I've told this to other artists who are friends of mine, we're in a beautiful moment talking about diaspora and talking about different people's cultures. We all come from someplace, and there's been this kind of homogenizing of, and I would say this is the case even for Western music, right? there's this homogenizing of the form into a top 40 song, and there's a lot of opportunity to look into one's history, to look into one's story, and try and personalize this experience and talk about where we've come from and how we interact with whatever is the zeitgeist voice at the moment. In terms of something that I'm doing right now, I'm working with a friend of mine, Cesar Urbina, who's an electronic artist who's on Infine in Paris in France. And he's also from Mexico originally, working on something that's going to be more pop focused, and work on something that's more improvisational and now actually uses electronic music and could perhaps even play in, a club or another contemporary setting. So for me, that's really good because I've been, La Marea, certainly even more so than Manu, is like serious, I put quotation marks there, but it's more serious work just because it's more intense and more introspective. So something that feels more ephemeral and more in the moment feels like a good next step so that I can recalibrate and figure out what I'm going to say next.
Thank you so much, Bryan Senti, and thank you for tuning into the Tonearm. If you enjoyed this conversation, you'll like at least one more of the nearly 300 episodes available in our free archive at thetonearm.com. While you're there, consider becoming a supporter. You do that by giving us your email address. The Tonearm is executive produced and hosted by me, Lawrence Purrier. We're produced and marketed by Michael Donaldson. Editing and sound design is by Terry Grant. Our theme music is by Birdie, spelled B-U-R-D-Y. Thanks for listening, be safe, and stay in touch.